The following video is an expansion off of research presented in the Lipscomb University Student Scholar Symposium of 2017. To start off with, I will be explaining some of the elements of journalistic practice that are deciding factors of what stories get covered and how the information for them is gathered. When journalists and editors seek out stories to cover, their primary concern is what is going to be considered newsworthy. There are multiple things that can make one story more newsworthy than another, but the key determining elements are timeliness, significance, proximity, human interest, and shock value. In the field of journalism, fresh news is the best news. The more recently an event occurred, or the more immediate the information provided by an article is needed, the more newsworthy it is to be covered. Most environmental concerns warrant no immediate action. Much of what we know about things like climate change are abstract concepts to people in their daily lives. While in theory, the prospect of ice caps melting, animals going extinct, and other environmental concerns are things people care about, they are distant concepts that might happen in the future. Therefore, they tend to get overlooked both by media and the general public. Seeking to meet the needs of human interest and shock value, much of environmental news coverage tends to be sensationalized. Natural disasters such as hurricanes and oil spills gain significant coverage because they are tangible occurrences that have an immediate impact. This leads to a disproportionate amount of coverage of the same occurrences and makes the focus of environmental reporting event-based rather than science-based. This has been the case for decades. Environmental reporting began to increase in popularity during the 1960s and 70s when the environmental movement first began. During this time, much of the coverage had to do with major events that were the catalyst for the sudden social interest in the environment. Some of these events included a disastrous breakup of a supertanker off the coast of southwest England in 1967, which can be seen here on the left, the Santa Barbara Channel oil leak in 1969, pictured on the top, and the release of the first NASA images of Earth from space. Environmental media remained popular, particularly during the times that these events were taking place, but as environmentalism became a more political topic and lost much of its shock value, coverage began to die out. In response to the increasingly political nature of environmental concerns, media outlets began adapting their coverage to be equally political in nature. In modern media, much of what we hear about environmental topics comes from the standpoint of political views. The biggest example of this is in coverage of climate change. While you would think that this coverage would be about the science behind climate change and the anthropogenic causes related to it, the coverage you see most often involves people, often politicians, arguing about whether or not climate change even exists. This is surprising considering that studies have shown that 97% of expert climate scientists agree that the climate is changing and that human activity is responsible. So why is it that if the vast majority of experts agree on this and have scientific backing to support it, news outlets are still running stories arguing whether or not climate change is real? The answer lies in the journalistic value of balance. Journalists are taught to remain as unbiased as possible. A typical news story will be written so that there is no definite opinion or conclusion to it, but rather a relaying of information. A journalist will be expected to get quotes from at least two, usually three people. Ideally, one quote will express one opinion or side, the second will express the opposing view, and the third will agree partially with both of the others. This story structure does not work well with scientific concerns. Numerous stories in the past 3 decades have been published that contain accurate, fact-based claims from expert scientists, and then opposing views from someone who really isn't qualified to speak on the matter. This problem of the media was identified by Professor Maxwell Boykoff as balance is bias. Balance is bias stories in recent years have encouraged the idea that climate science is unreliable and untrustworthy, which only serve to increase the number of stories focusing on the arguments rather than the science. Even journalists who do not fall into the trap of seeking balance suffer from a lack of scientific background. Most journalists have little or no education related to science after they leave high school, which makes the prospect of attempting to interpret scientific data and write about it in a way that everyone can understand a very daunting task. This is one of the many reasons that in-depth environmental reporting has become less and less common. I interviewed Tim Gianni, a veteran journalist who teaches the journalism practicum here at Lipscomb University, to get a better understanding of what other factors contribute to the lack of in-depth reporting that is seen in modern media. Gianni, who has worked in Tennessee as a journalist since 1974, attributed this decline in in-depth reporting to a decline in the number of reporters. He believes because there are now so few journalists covering so many different topics, they never have time to truly delve into stories and end up writing a lot of surface-level or sensationalized stories. Online news sites are constantly seeking to get the most views on their articles and to retain the most readers because that's how they make money from advertisers. This means they want sensational headlines and eye-catching photos and videos to go along with them. This is just another reason why sensationalized stories and natural disaster reports are so common. Fortunately, the visual nature of environmental concerns means that media outside of news coverage has been increasing. In recent years, there has been what has been described as a green wave in filmmaking. Numerous environmental documentaries, such as March of the Penguins and the Earth series, as well as mainstream animation films like WALL-E, have brought environmental issues to public attention. One of my favorite examples of this is the documentary Chasing Ice, which recounts James Balog's process of setting up time-lapse cameras to show reductions to the size of ice caps in 4 different areas. The movie shows the struggles the scientists faced just to set up the cameras and retrieve the photos, as well as the campaigning they had to do afterwards to get people to actually see their work. The post-production campaigning that they had to do is an example of the reason most films fail to actually make a difference in terms of combating environmental problems. Most films will tell an audience that there is a problem, but won't offer any direction for what they should do with this information. So people will just forget what they learned in the movie and move on. Chasing Ice was actually the documentary that really inspired my interest in sustainability, and was also part of why I chose this topic to research. It was fascinating to me to see how much of a difference could be made by having a physical representation, in this case, Balog's time-lapse videos, to educate people about environmental concerns. It was also interesting to look into different methods that have been developed to try to understand how internal and external factors, such as the ones I've described throughout this video, can impact media coverage of climate change. In the course of my research, I have ultimately concluded that the role that media portrayal plays in educating the general public about environmental concerns, specifically climate change, should be primarily an introduction. A news story, no matter how in-depth, cannot provide the scientific context necessary to truly educate someone, and the nature of news stories means that the focus will always be on entertaining before educating. In areas of the world where we have access to the means to educate ourselves about environmental concerns and begin taking steps to lessen our impact on the world, we should do so. If news coverage begins introducing environmental concerns and redirecting readers to additional resources where they can learn more about them and how they can work to combat them, then I believe it could have a positive impact on how our environmental concerns are understood. I hope that this video has provided you with a better understanding of the processes that go into reporting, as well as some of the challenges that journalists face in news gathering, and specifically how this pertains to environmental reporting. To learn more about the information discussed in this video, visit the resources listed below. And if you have any questions regarding my research, email me at almcclure@mail.lipscomb.edu.